right, thank you, Bob. Good evening, everyone. It's a joy to be with you. Preventing euthanasia and encouraging hope is my mission. It's what I'm most passionate about, and this is pretty urgent because Canada has become the euthanasia capital of the world. In Canada, 1 in 20 deaths is a death by euthanasia. Euthanasia now accounts for the 5th leading cause of death in my country, and this means that almost not a day goes by that I do not hear a personal story of how euthanasia is touching people's lives. And if you think about how, since legalization in 2016, 70,000 Canadians have had their lives prematurely ended by a doctor or a nurse in a hospital or in a home or even in national parks, as our government is advertising. Think of the ripple effect for families. And you might be wondering, partly because I just got here, what is it that leads me to this mission? The cultural urgency is clear, but when I reflect on what it is that gave me this spark and this motivation to dedicate myself to this completely, first, it was family. It was an early sensitivity to death, looking back, that led me to this ethical sensitivity, because when I was just 2.5 years old, my baby brother died at age 7 months. And growing up, my parents wanted to make sure that we would remember him. So each year we had a cupcake on the anniversary of his birthday into earth and his birthday into heaven, and I would watch home video of him in order to cherish this brother I lost. They wanted me to get to know him, and in a certain sense, I've grown up with him. If you think about the people in your lives who you've lost, isn't there a kind of sense in which you continue to grow in relation to them? And so I had this sense that this brother had value not only because of what he could do, he didn't do very much, but because he was my brother and I was his sister. Another key influence in my life was my grandfather. My grandfather lived with my family for several years, throughout my high school and university years, from the time that he was 89 until he died, thankfully a natural death, at age 96. And it was during those years that the government started talking about legalizing euthanasia for those whose deaths are deemed reasonably foreseeable. And with a 90-year-old in the home, I realized that this concerns people like him, families like mine. This concerns me personally. So some years later, I began working with a member of parliament, and the issue of the day became the expansion of euthanasia. I mentioned that Canada had legalized euthanasia in 2016. We did not have a referendum. Instead, there had been a court decision, a Supreme Court decision, that compelled Parliament to make a law. And so Parliament set the law, and initially, as we might expect, and as we see in every jurisdiction, there were supposed safeguards. Euthanasia was limited to those whose deaths were deemed, as I said, reasonably foreseeable, and who were suffering a grievous and irremediable condition, whose suffering was intolerable to them. And so that was the criteria with which euthanasia was brought in. And each year, even with that criteria, the numbers grew, and more people were taking up the option to have their life cut short. When I began working in politics, it was the midst of the COVID pandemic. And that is when the government began expanding euthanasia on the basis of disability and mental illness. This really got to me because even before that technical expansion, a friend of mine, I had gone for dinner with her. She has cerebral palsy, she uses a wheelchair, and one day she got pretty sick. And she went to the hospital. She was alone in the capital city. Her friends and family were all traveling. And she went to check herself into the hospital, and the doctor who came over to see her said, "Whatever you have, it's really affecting your breathing. And if it comes to it, you might need oxygen. Is that something you would want?" And she said, "Yes, I think so." But then the doctor looked at her pityingly and followed it up with the question, "Are you sure?" And she says, "Apparently I qualified to an end to my life right there. I know my situation must have looked bad. I was a single woman, alone, tired, and pretty sick. But I was the same woman at the hospital that day as I was having just finished my dual degree program and living independently and working my job." So these were the stories I was beginning to hear. And it was very painful to be working in the midst of the pandemic, receiving emails from various people about how this legislation, how this expansion of euthanasia on the basis of disability and mental illness would affect people and their loved ones. We put out a website, the Member of Parliament with whom I worked, titled "No Same-Day Death," because this new legislation was eroding all of those safeguards that had been deemed essential just some days prior, and enabling people to be killed on the very date that they requested if they were in that first track of reasonably foreseeable death. Track 2 became the disability track. And so we put out that petition campaign, and many people signed it, and then we put out a call for stories and said, "We need your stories to fight this bill." And during the pandemic, there I was, a young person full of ideals, working in politics, pouring through hundreds of personal stories of suicide in the family, of mental illness, of people begging and imploring us not to allow this expansion to people who are most vulnerable in our community. And that's when I realized we really have a cultural crisis in Canada and in similar countries, and indeed our countries are very similar. It started to occur to me that we don't even so much have just a culture of death as we seem to have death without culture. And I thought we need to bring cultural renewal to death and dying. We need to rekindle those experiences of natural dying and death within the family, of living with people who we cherish simply because we love them. So now I want to share a little bit about why people are requesting euthanasia, first of all, based on the Canadian experience. Then I want to share a little bit about why people are acquiescing as family members and supporting their loved ones in seeking an end to their life early. And why are doctors and nurses getting involved increasingly? And finally, why do we oppose euthanasia? And what do we have to propose instead? Now, when it comes to this issue of why people are really asking for euthanasia, it always begins to be proposed as a means to alleviate suffering. And yet, what we find increasingly is that by people's own admission, the number one kind of suffering leading to request euthanasia in Canada is not pain or even the fear of pain, which are grouped together in the same category. It's not even feeling like a burden or financial considerations or lack of access to palliative care. All of those are on the list. But the number one kind of suffering by people's own admission leading them to request euthanasia is the inability to engage in meaningful life activities. Inability to engage in meaningful life activities. And the second biggest kind of suffering, according to people's own admission, is the inability to perform the daily activities of personal care. Some people say, if I can no longer go to the washroom by myself, just kill me. But what message does that send to people who, for one reason or another, live much or some of their life in that condition? The message it sends is, I would rather be dead than be you. Now, even before euthanasia had been legalized in Canada, I had a friend of mine who told me that growing up, her mother used to say that she would seek an assisted suicide. And my friend was really finding this peculiar, and eventually, the teenager that she was mustered the courage to ask her mom, "Why do you keep talking like this? It's rather upsetting, Mom." And she said, well, if I'm ever suffering or in a great deal of pain, I might say something really mean and hateful, and then no one would love me. And my friend, again, was a teenager, and she was quick thinking enough to say, Mom, you already say mean and hateful things, and I still love you. But it betrays this insecurity, and there's something there. Who will love me this way? Who will love me in my disability, in my chronic illness, in my impatience, in my stubbornness, with my dementia, whatever it may be? Who will love me this way? And so a loss of meaning, a desire for autonomy and control, that's also a big one. But autonomy is an interesting one too, because in Canada, we call it medical assistance in dying, which has since been abbreviated to MAID. First it was euthanasia, then assisted suicide, but since we seek generally to prevent suicide, it was rebranded to physician-assisted dying. But since that might be detrimental to the doctor-patient trust and relationship, it was further rebranded to medical aid in dying, and now it is known ubiquitously as MAID. And in Canada, that includes both the direct euthanasia, a lethal injection provided by a doctor or nurse, and assisted suicide, which is where the person administers the lethal substance to him or herself. The US only has assisted suicide, Canada has both, and the vast, vast majority of people opt for direct euthanasia because there's a kind of mutual outsourcing of responsibility. The doctor or nurse says, I'm simply enacting the patient's will, and the person says, well, I'm simply undergoing a medical procedure. So these are some of the dynamics. Autonomy and control. This is a key one. The more that I read the accounts of people seeking euthanasia, the more convinced I am that euthanasia is a form of self-harm. And we tend to think of self-harm as something that young people struggle with, whether it's eating disorders or cutting. These are real problems. And what message does it send to a young person who might be struggling with those things? If her grandmother chooses to end her life because she's seeking to control life when it seems uncontrollable. She's seeking to put into control an out-of-control situation. These are the deep and existential dynamics, and this is also how these issues, sad as they are, can become a basis for intergenerational solidarity. When we open up and when we bear those insecurities like that mother and daughter did in that conversation. Why have people become so acquiescing? Well, Canadians are very nice, generally, and want to go along and be supportive and not become estranged from a loved one who might be seeking euthanasia. And so, by and large, people think I ought to be supportive. But what does the support? Euthanasia is suicide. Even the Justice Minister in Canada admitted that euthanasia is a species of suicide, as he put it. Why do we live in a society where some people get suicide prevention and other people get suicide assistance? Everybody deserves suicide prevention. But sometimes it seems like the compassionate and reasonable thing to alleviate suffering by eliminating the person. This is the confusion and this is the delusion. But when people experience it, there tends to be a visceral awareness that comes to mind. I'll tell you the story about an Uber driver who I encountered. I talk about euthanasia with everyone, even on the plane to come here, with Uber drivers, Airbnb hosts, because this is my mission. And so I got into the Uber, and the driver asked, "Are you going to work?" And I said, "Kind of." And he said, "Well, what do you do for work?" I said, "I prevent euthanasia, and I encourage hope." He was surprised, and he said, "Well, my dad had MAID. It hasn't even been a year." I said, "Would you like to talk about it?" And he said, "Actually, I would." He said, "My father was an ideal candidate for MAID. He was quite elderly. He had stage 4 cancer. My mother supported him. All of the brothers agreed, and it was able to be administered in their living room. Okay. But then he said, I have to tell you though, it's the most effed up thing in the world when you know that your father is going to die in 7 days, then 5 days, then 3 days, and then in 15 minutes. And you're powerless. And you're just waiting for this to happen, like some inevitability. Then he was able to remember something else. He said that his father went to the doctor, and it was November. His father asked, is there a chance that I could make it to Christmas? And the doctor said to him, there is a chance you could make it to Christmas, but if you do, it probably wouldn't be a Christmas with you that your family would want to remember. That is a push off the ledge. That is the kind of coercion. He never even said the word MAID or euthanasia. These are the sinister, subliminal messages that are being sent. And so he had recalled that incident, and then he also told me that his mother has hardly gone back into that living room again. But they all wanted to be supportive. And as he said, he thought that this program was made for someone like his father. I had a similar kind of surprising conversation with a woman at an Airbnb. This Chinese woman in Vancouver owned an Airbnb with many rooms, and there was a Turkish man staying there. I was staying there, a few others, and one day she invited us all to have Chinese dumplings with her. So we sit down, and the question comes, what do you do for work? And I say, well, I prevent euthanasia, and I encourage hope. And this look of radical consternation that this is a job in Canada. And then this Chinese woman says, well, I think that if I was suffering, I would like the doctor to suicide me. That's how she put it. The Turkish man sitting there looked at her, shocked and aghast, and said, do not say that. You are really scaring me right now. I like you. And then I turned to her and I said, weren't you telling all of us here just a few minutes ago about your grandchildren who are 5 and 10 years old? Yes. Well, if this is the reaction of a Turkish stranger in your Airbnb, then imagine the reaction there would be in your 5 and 10-year-old grandchildren. And she said, well, I hadn't thought about it like that. I was only thinking of my own pain. And that's often the case. When we are suffering, we tend to close in on ourselves. And so I would not fault someone for experiencing some degree of suicidal ideation in this life. Life is hard. We all struggle. We all suffer. So that's understandable. But what is not acceptable, what we cannot abide, is people conceding and capitulating to what is basically suicidal ideation. That's not acceptable. All kinds of things we could suffer are made so much worse if we know that upon getting a disability or upon developing an illness, we become part of the eligible demographic to die. That's worse than the illness itself. And having a criteria is itself dehumanizing. The very criteria that seems to have a rationale and a logic to it is what sends a social message that there is a category of people who deserve not to exist. I've had people with disabilities tell me that euthanasia is the only thing the government is telling me that I qualify for. And euthanasia is lowering the standard of care, but even worse, it's lowering the level of curiosity among us. The curiosity, which is the truest compassion that says, what are you going through? And is curious enough to wait for an answer. What about doctors and nurses? The healing profession. I'm asked all the time, don't doctors take the Hippocratic Oath? What happened to first do no harm? Well, there's a Canadian euthanasia doctor who wrote a memoir about her experience. And she actually addresses the Hippocratic Oath. And she says, I didn't see myself as violating it. I didn't see myself as doing harm. The underlying illness was doing that. I saw myself as helping. So this inversion, you can have a good principle, but we need to clarify to our society first, what is harm? We'll come to that later in the next session too. What is harm? We need to clarify that. So, first principles, and that the principles only work if they're imbued with a proper content. And as euthanasia has become increasingly popular, people are desensitized. This is the challenge. Euthanasia has gone from being exceptional to routine. It's gone from being an extenuating circumstance to presented, as one article put it, the ideal way to die. There was even an article titled The European Way to Die about euthanasia. That same euthanasia doctor I mentioned gave a TED talk in which she said, imagine you can choose the time of your death. Imagine you can have everyone gather around. She doesn't mention pain or suffering at all. Fundamentally, it's about control. And that's why this is such a deeper question. It's not principally a medical question. It's an existential question. Why live until we die? And that's what makes it so interesting and so actually human for us to attend to. This touches every demographic, every age, every nationality, because these are the deeply human questions about whether it's good to be in the world after all, in the face of suffering and illness. So we've got to clarify this, because as more and more doctors begin to participate, it becomes normalized, people become desensitized. A woman came up to me after a talk, 28 years old, and she said, before your talk, I felt that I never had permission to grieve my grandmother's death by euthanasia. Because the story that my family tells is that this was good, that she did the right thing, and that we ought to have supported her. But now I feel that permission to say that it was really wrong, it was really wounding. Because as she told me, if my grandmother, who was the strongest person in my life, the matriarch of the family, no one messed with her, would go through with this, what message does that send to me? How can I withstand my mental health challenges, she said. So why are we against it? Still, yet, we have more to clarify in terms of the value of life and whether life is always worth living. I think the main thing I would want to put to you is that euthanasia is really, quite literally, the opposite of love. The reason comes down to what is love. Love says, it's good you exist. I want you to be. You belong in the world. Whereas euthanasia says, maybe it's not so good you exist. Maybe you would be better off dead. That's why having euthanasia suggested, or even fitting the supposed demographic for it, already kills the person. Already deflates and defeats a person's sense of value. But we've got to get creative with these ways of speaking about it. Euthanasia is the opposite of love. Euthanasia represents a declaration of defeat, not of freedom. Euthanasia is a form of self-harm. Euthanasia does damage to self-esteem. This requires exercising our moral imagination so that we can communicate to a culture that is struggling with all of their own difficulties before the face of their own suffering and death. A big part of my work, as I mentioned, is having casual conversations every day about suffering, death, meaning, and hope. And despite the heavy topic, this is tremendously life-giving and energizing work. I could not be happier, and it brought me also to New Zealand, which is cool. Another thing that becomes such a basis for my hope is the stories that people confide, and the way that people come to have the humility that their story is important enough for the benefit of others to also learn something of the truth concerning these very weighty and sensitive topics. So I make short films and interview people, and their stories deserve to be heard even more than me. So I'm going to play one of these short films of a family member and how euthanasia impacted him, and then I'll comment on that for a minute at the end.
My opposition to euthanasia is not speculative, it's not abstract, it's not theoretical, it is experiential because I watched doctors kill my father in front of my family on a family member's birthday.
Tell me about your father's life.
Growing up, my dad was a complex man. He was, in many ways, a very loving father. He was very, very proud of having his kids. He would hug you very quickly. He was an affectionate guy, but he also had a dark side. And I noticed this as a teen. He would talk about drifting off into Georgian Bay on a canoe, never to return again. And he would talk about deaths he witnessed in the police. And it wasn't until years later that I saw that as indicative of somebody who's deeply traumatized or deeply depressed. But that was the dark side of him. The light side was this loving, jovial man who would laugh heartily.
Were you concerned that he would commit suicide long before euthanasia was ever legal?
Absolutely. My dad had been suicidal in the past. I dealt with it at different times. And so when MAID came along, it was the perfect flattery. It's telling him suicide is okay. It's telling him, it's dignity. It's somehow even beautiful or something like this.
On what basis did your father apply for and be deemed eligible for euthanasia?
2 months after the government expanded euthanasia for people who were not imminently dying, my father applied for it under that new law. He had arthritis, diabetes, chronic conditions like that. None of them were imminently fatal, and that's how he applied for MAID.
He was approved on that basis?
He was approved on that basis, as far as we can tell. Frailty was another reason.
Some proponents of euthanasia have said that family members are their biggest problem. What do you think about that?
I find that remarkable. The people most affected by a MAID death before and after it occurs, outside of the person dying, are the family members. We're the ones who have to live with the grief, the anticipation of the upcoming death, the questions, especially if there's doubt about the qualifying illness, if we weren't consulted, but also there is no legal requirement for the assessors to reach out to family members. In our case, we weren't contacted about my father's MAID until 2 days before he died.
Did the news of your father's impending death by euthanasia come as a shock?
It shocked us that he applied, and then it shocked us again because he was killed halfway through the 90-day assessment period for people whose deaths aren't reasonably foreseeable. It was a Wednesday. We got a call from his provider. A provider is the term they use for the person who administers the lethal injection, and that person is also an assessor. In this case, it was a doctor, and said that essentially that your dad's scheduled to die on Friday, and if you want to see him before he dies, you have 2 days to get here. So you have to move quickly. I pushed for a last-minute psychiatric assessment, and then after he died, I managed to get a copy. It's one of the few documents I have about his MAID, is a slightly redacted copy of his psychiatric assessment, and it's full of errors. Claims he wasn't suicidal, and he had this whole history of suicidality. It states that he didn't think he was depressed, and yet on the list of medications, it lists antidepressants.
Did you hope until the last moment that you might be able to change his mind?
Absolutely. I tried to explain to him that he couldn't kill himself on a family member's birthday, that was wrong. I tried a soft touch, I tried a hard touch.
Now, tell me about the day of and being in the room.
I mean, that was the worst day of my life. That day and those moments in that room, there's nothing. I've been through some things in my life, and there's absolutely nothing that compares to it. We were lost. All of us are trying to make sense of a situation that defies sense. The provider was sitting beside me, like on a couch right next to me, injecting very large syringes of propofol, which looks like milk, and other drugs into my father and taking his life. His head flopped down on his bed when he went unconscious. He was propped up. A few seconds before, he'd been animated. And then he was a corpse.
Christopher, what gives you the strength to speak out and share your story on this?
I can't not. You know, sometimes things happen to you in your life and you're compelled to speak out.
How can we be there for each other in the midst of a euthanasia society?
I think we have to find each other. We can share our experiences, we can share our emotions, find support groups. I have had no trouble in the suicide group I belong to. You'll be accepted there. People recognize MAID as suicide. I've shared my story because it's been a help to me to share it. And it might be help to you to share your story too. Please feel free to share this video with other people. You never know how your story or my story might be a help to somebody else.
So this story is about Christopher. Christopher is a man who starts off by saying, my opposition to euthanasia is not abstract or speculative, but that he's against euthanasia because he watched doctors kill his father in front of his family, surrounded by family members on one of those family members' birthdays. And that is something that we're seeing more and more, that family members are choosing a significant anniversary, and doctors are not fazed by that. But this autonomy and expressive individualism is so wounding, and it affects multiple generations. So Christopher goes on to share about how it's quite a vivid video because he was actually present at the death, and he saw the doctor come and sit right by him and administer the lethal drugs. And he comes from a completely secular perspective where he just felt shattered, and he explains why this was the worst day of his life. A couple other short films that I've produced. There's one featuring a man named Roger Foley, who's been in the hospital for several years, and he has been offered euthanasia multiple times despite wanting to live. And the reason he's in hospital is due to inadequate home care. And another short film features an elderly woman in Canada who always discouraged her family members from getting tattoos. However, when the Canadian government legalized euthanasia, she got a tattoo that says, "Don't euthanize me," right on her arm. So the doctors and nurses come over, give her a thumbs up. She is pretty fiery. And what's so moving about that short film, all of these are 4 or 5 minutes, and you can see them on my website, dyingtomeetyou.com. Come see me later and I can give you the website. I befriended her. When I got back to my hometown, everyone said, "You've got to meet Christine. If you're all about preventing euthanasia and encouraging hope, you have to meet the tattoo lady." I said, "Okay. Can I email her?" "Nope, doesn't have a computer. Can't really see either." "Okay." So step by step, we got acquainted. I started visiting her. And after several meetings, she agreed to be in a short film. We're recording the interview, and I asked her about why she's against euthanasia on camera, and she speaks about an earlier suicide attempt in her life while she was a young mom with many adopted children. And that was very moving because she had never told me that before. Only when the cameras were rolling did she admit to this former suicide attempt, clarifying to her the value of life. How powerful. And so she was not some pious woman moralizing, but she was someone who had been on the brink and was able to speak with a kind of credibility and vulnerability. We have a lot of brokenness, we have a lot of woundedness, we have a lot of estrangement in families. My mother was telling me about an alienated grandparents kind of groups that exist all across North America, maybe beyond. There's a lot of estrangement. So these issues are all part of putting the family first. And if we want to attend to these cultural crises, we need to dig deep into our own hearts. Sometimes it can be so sorrowful and painful to see that brokenness, but what I see through all the short films I produce is that there is fruitfulness and value. Whatever we struggle with in our families, whatever is even a weakness in our family life, can become a strength, can become for the public benefit. And that's something I really see in the work that I do. When Christopher was willing to be in a video, I was reflecting on his father's death, which was so tragic, and which had initially seemed to me to be only bleak. But after he shared with me his experience, candidly, first of all at a cafe before we made the video, I looked at him and I said, your father's life and even his death by these terrible circumstances will be more fruitful than he knew how to make it because of your testimony. And that's also a word of hope for us. We might think that anything that goes wrong in our families is an anomaly, or maybe even disqualifies us. But it's precisely where our passion intersects with the needs of the world, where whatever we have suffered and undergone ourselves meets the crises of our time. And the fact that we have suffered and lived particular things lends itself to our own mission in life and in the culture. I see that as such a basis for hope. So I would encourage you throughout the rest of the conference to think about what is even less than ideal in my family. It shouldn't be that hard. And to consider how you can leverage even that, because when we're honest about the struggle and the crises of our time, we can do a lot of good coming alongside. Many people opting for euthanasia, it betrays this insecurity that I will have anyone to stay with me. That's why it's not simply autonomous. People want someone at their side. I read the obituaries of people dying by euthanasia in Canada regularly. I have a Google alert on MAID, and most of the results that I get in my inbox are obituaries. Hundreds of them that mention MAID. There are obituaries where people spend more time naming the members of the team of medical professionals who are killing them than they name family members. That is the extent of the crisis. So this is not only a matter of fighting the next euthanasia expansion or one bill, it's so much deeper. And that's both much more work, but also much more human, much more meaningful for the long run. So sometimes people are seeking euthanasia because they're bereaved. They've lost their spouse and they don't have a sense of identity anymore. What do we say to the widows and widowers? What do we say in the face of the loss of memory with dementia? We have a lot of work to do to put the family first in these policy discussions, but also to show to admit the deep challenges that are also in us. This is not an us and them fight. This is an us and a we fight. Because this temptation to self-rejection is even in us. People say, well, isn't it good that it's voluntary? If what someone is consenting to, if what someone is asking for is to be killed, that's a red flag. We have to scrutinize the choices. And in a world where we're so sensitive to the fact that other people can discard, dismiss, and discount us, we're all too sensitive to that. Hopefully we can cultivate the humility to recognize when we are also at risk of discarding, dismissing, or discounting ourselves. So it's a heavy topic, but I hope that whets your appetite for seeing how this issue can be an issue of hope that promotes intergenerational solidarity, and that you get inspired to go find not only the stories that I was not able to show today, but also the stories that already exist here in New Zealand that are waiting and begging to be told.